Quickly acknowledge my colleagues Sam Carrick and David Pearman. First, I want to have a quick look at that question of whether soil and land matter in the whole issue of water quality. And they do, because there we are down there with the water quality and the issues, and it depends on everything that's happening in the soil, all of those soil processes, and what's being loaded on as a result of the land management. This is just a quick picture of the nitrogen cycle. We do need good information on the land, how it's been managed in the past, how it's being managed now, and how it might be managed in the future. And we need good information on the soil, how it can reduce or intensify the impact of that land management. Just in case you're not convinced, I've got one more slide to tell about the soil, and this really highlights it. So here we have the raw effluent. It's an experimental site with two different soils. Effluent's been poured on top and it's been measured underneath and poured into the other two bottles. So here it is from a clay soil, definitely still some of that raw effluent there in that leachate, whereas here in the pumice soil, it's done a wonderful job of filtering out that raw effluent in nice clean water. So soils are really important. So information on the soil and land, plus a bit of modelling, lets us do a whole lot of things and contribute to that limit setting process. It can produce estimates of the nutrient loads into surface and groundwater. It can help with identifying which are the really significant sources in any given catchment. You can look at quantifying the impact of this policy or that policy and what the effect of that is on water quality, or on the mitigations and how effective they might be. Use it for visualising and assessing allocation options. But the key to all of that is you need to be working with some good information, otherwise you're going to be making very poor decisions. So my brief today has been to just talk a little bit about some of the science advances in the last 5 or so years in these 3 different areas: the soil information, land information, nutrient load information. So moving into the soil information first, so 2 big areas. One is we're much better now at characterising what soils we have and what their properties are. We do this via a tool called SMAP, which I'll explain in a moment. But we're much better at knowing how it is that water is moving through the soils, how it's being stored there. We can do all sorts of vulnerability maps, which I'll show you. Natural capital is something that a number of people have been putting some time into, working at how we can quantify it and characterise the natural capital inherent within soils. Digital soil modelling is another really good advance that's helping us map across much wider areas of New Zealand than we've been able to do to date by using the topography and other layers to model what the soil distribution is. We've been looking at the soil processes, lots of new technologies, wireless sensor networks for soil moisture, large-scale lysimeters, EM mapping. There's a whole lot of technology out there that's telling us a lot more about our soils. Sampling strategies, how to best measure or estimate the effect of the urine patches and how that can be sampled. Contaminant transport, there's also been some good work done here in understanding better how the phosphorus, nitrogen, bugs and heavy metals are moving through the soil. And there's been some work in the sedimentation process modelling. So I'm going to look at I can't do it all today, we've only got 20 minutes, so I'm going to particularly look at the ones in red. But first of all, let's have a look at SMAP for those who don't know what it is. It is New Zealand's new soil information system. And the key thing about this is a lot more than a soil map, as you will see. It is a soil information system to support tools and policy. Starting down the bottom, there's the spatial information combined with the National Soils Database. This is where scientists and people have gone out to a particular location, dug a hole, dug a pit, taken samples from that pit, sent it off to the laboratory, got some really technical measurements, and all of that gets stored in the National Soils Database. So it's point data, whereas this is spatial data. But they get combined in what we call the inference engine with the pedo transfer functions, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the next slide. That gets delivered through a range of different ways. The main one is SMAP Online. This is where you can go on and find a location within New Zealand, click on it, see what the soil is, and get a whole lot of information on the fact sheets about the properties of that soil. We deliver the data directly in its GIS layers through the LRES portal. We deliver it directly to some of the government organisations. We're also been working on doing web feature services so that we can directly connect with other tools and users. But let's just look a bit more about that inference engine, because that's where the real power of SMAP comes from, as I'll explain. Soil knowledge comes in all sorts of different shapes and forms. So we have the experimental data up there on the right, the expert knowledge with my colleagues, the heritage data that we've got, all sorts of decision trees, the statistical modelling that's happening, process formulae, for example. All of that gets coalesced, codified in what we call the pedo transfer function codes. The data that feeds into this inference engine is, as I said, the soil survey data, the complicated technical data, and what we're often doing is using that a small amount of technical information, looking for the relationship so that we can then say a lot more about the key soil properties over a much wider area. So it's using the easily measured data to tell us more about the data that we can't measure so easily. And then other layers as well, the EM mapping, for example, or rainfall layers are all important information that influence this inference engine. But the real power of it is that if there are any changes down here, for example, in the source data, it immediately propagates through into the information that we're providing to the users into the models. Or if there's changes in the knowledge that we have through experimental information, for example, again, all we need to do is go into the code, change it, modify it for that new updated knowledge, and it immediately propagates through into all of that soil information. The other way, it works the other way too, that if the models and users at the top end have changes in their requirements, it's very easy to go into here and change it so that we can then meet those new requirements. And the other key thing about it is it's documented, because I can assure you that it's really quite hard to go into the heads of my colleagues to extract out this valuable information they know. When it's there in the code, it's much more accessible. So this is what means that this is what makes SMAP such a flexible, dynamic soil information system that contributes to catchment regional scale modelling of water quality. Let's look at a particular example of how that works. So the soils really vary. One of the key properties for nutrient losses is how the water moves through the soil. It can move in two different ways. It can just filter down through gently, or it might find those large pores or macropore flows in the cracks and just flow straight through, taking the nutrients with it. That's one key property. The other is the storage in the soil. How much water can be stored? If it's a nice big deep soil, then the water will sit in there and the roots can take the nitrogen up. But if it's a shallow soil, what can happen is with the application of irrigation or rainfall, it flushes through and it takes those nitrogen or the nitrates, nutrients down beyond the root zone. So these two aspects of the properties of how water moves through the soil are very important. So what we've done with an SMAP using this inference engine is there's the technical information that I was telling you about before, the stuff that's been measured, the point data. We do some statistical modelling on it to create a statistical relationship of some of those key technical parameters, which we can then take across to SMAP and map it out spatially. So this particular map is this is the water holding capacity, the storage of the soil in terms of its water holding capacity. And the blue soils, this happens to be around Masterton, blue soils were deep soils, they can hold lots of water, but these brown soils are quite shallow and they're at risk of losing that nitrogen below the root zone. So that's an example of one pedotransfer function. There are lots of others. Some of them focus on some of the risks, the soil factors that affect the risks of leaching of nitrogen and phosphorus, bypass flow, runoff or the overland flow. So here's a map that brings all of those risks together. So obviously for Canterbury, so the pinks and the reds are the leaching risk. The browns and the oranges is more the overland flow risk, where there's higher risk, and the greens is where there's less risk. So this particular map is one that Environment Canterbury are looking at the moment in terms of their regional land and water plan, to perhaps from a consenting point of view that if you're in some of these higher risk areas, you might need to take more consideration of the management practices that are happening there. And particularly it's more relevant in these high risk areas, some of the mitigations that Richard was talking about, and identification of those critical source areas becomes even really more important. Now you might be wondering about phosphorus leaching. Richard did mention it, we are finding it, and this is just a quick slide to show you. We hear lots about nitrogen leaching, but this is about phosphorus leaching. It's particularly in these stony soils in capacity. This is a scoping study that colleagues did. 2 different soils, very similar soils, both of them stony. One of them had a sand lens in it, and that's the two lines. 3 management practices were simulated. So fertiliser was applied there, urine patch was applied there, and dairy shed effluent was applied there. The y-axis is the total phosphorus accumulated. And across time, there really wasn't a lot of difference happening here with this capital application of fertiliser because it was a newly sown pasture. But there, at the urine, clearly a big change and a big effect. The phosphorus was going straight down and being reached at the bottom. Not so much effect with the dairy shed effluent. So just, there in some soils there's certainly a problem with the phosphorus leaching. Right, let's move on to the land information. So that was the soil information advances. Now let's look land information. And of course the key driver is how land is being managed. And this is where the MGM project, which stands for the Matrix for Good Management, and what they're trying to do, it's a big collaborative project as you can see, and they've got a couple of activities, one of which is to survey the farms and see what is happening out there now. The second is to agree a set of good management practices across all of these different sectors. So with this work, we're now getting a much better handle on what people are doing, or should be doing, if they were following good management practice. The next step is to know how, where. Where are they doing these practices? So remote sensing can inform this, because you can see what some of these key practices are. Producing maps at the paddock scale, there's a few, this is new technology, a new process that my colleagues have been developing. A couple of key steps to it. One is identifying automatically the paddock boundaries where things are happening. It's much more accurate to do that than just look at a per pixel basis. And then secondly, to collect a multi-temporal sequence of images. We're talking about 18 months here, so going right through the year, through the winter. What they're doing is looking at the spectral information from the imagery together with the timing of when they expect certain events to happen, like harvesting, like the growth of a crop. The different colours will help them. When they can identify, match what they're seeing with the timing and the colours with what they're expecting, they're starting to produce some quite nice information on what the crops are. This is a little patch of Canterbury. The blue ones there are the winter forage crops and the timing of when it's been grazed. The orangey yellow ones are some of the different crops that are there. If you can't read it, it's sort of brassica, grass for seed, white clover and so on. You can read it, it's quite interesting. You can see, if I can jump up there, that is pasture, but it's a strip grazing. And that's what you're seeing with the paddock boundaries coming through. And that's been detected from the imagery. This is just a little rectangle on a larger bit of Canterbury. There it is over there, the little white triangle. So here you can really start seeing that it's quite a cost-effective way of getting quite a lot of information over an area of land. And in fact, there's quite a lot of this blue winter grazing, which of course is a high loading scenario. This has been taken to a bigger scale still. This is for Southland region, same kind of idea. They're interested in the winter forage as well, a bit hard to see there, so there's a zoom in, sort of Invercargill down the bottom. All of the orange little rectangles are the paddocks where there is winter grazing or winter forage, and the yellow ones is where there's likely to be. And there's some 70,000 hectares in the Southland region are likely to be winter fallow, plus another 55,000 are possibly. This is adding up to 14% of the agricultural area, which is quite a significant source of high loading. Of course, it will depend on what the soil is in each of these locations as well, and also where it is in relation to the sensitive water bodies. But the key point here is it is quite a cost-effective way now of collecting some of this really useful information on the land practices that are key to water quality. If Finally, let's have a quick look at the advances in the nutrient load information. There's my 14% down there. But now I've moved on to the nutrient load information. Overseer, we all know about this. There have been some really good advances in Overseer over the last 5 years. The estimates of particularly nitrate losses are more accurate. The MGM matrix, I talked about the management practices, but the other key output from the MGM project is a matrix, a great big matrix full of numbers of nitrate losses. So what's happening there is it's combining that farm survey information, like my mouse, the farm nutrient modelling using Overseer, soils and climates, and producing this great big matrix full of all the losses that are expected under the good management plan, good management practices that have been agreed across all of these different industries, across all of the different soils and climates in Canterbury. This is going to be an amazing resource for the next part of what I'm going to show you, which is calculating the nutrient loads in catchments. That's due in about 4 or 5 months' time. So finally, the nutrient loads under various scenarios. So this particular example is in the Waimea. So Tasman District Council were interested in nutrient losses that is going into the estuary. No mouse gone? No mouse, there it is. Up here. So this is a map of the estimated current loads. That's nitrogen we're talking about here, so kilograms per hectare. Colour scheme, blue is very little, red is 40 kilograms per hectare or more. So quite high losses. That's where it's at the moment as we estimate it. This is what might happen if the area were to be 100% irrigated. That's the 23% increase in the total load, estimated load. Because there's more integration, there's a bit more dilution, so it would be a 6% increase in the concentration. And then we looked at a bit more of a worst case scenario. What would happen if it went to 100% market gardens? And here you can really see this patch of very stony, gravelly soils there that are the high risk situation in that market gardening scenario. And in this particular scenario, 50% increase in the load and a 19% increase in the concentration. The next step, once you've got these nitrogen loads, and if that goes through the process and a limit is agreed, that limit then needs to be translated back into load allocation for individual landowners. So this particular slide was produced once the Selwyn Waihora group had agreed their load and then distributed, in this case just equally across everyone. And then you can see who gains, who loses. Because in this case, the blue ones, to get down to that average value or that equal allocation, they would have to drop by 30, 40, 30%. They'd have to reduce the expected nitrogen losses from their system because of the soils that they're on and because of the particular land management that they have. Whereas these people in the brown, they would actually gain under this particular allocation system because they happen to be on the poorly drained soils where there's lots of denitrification. So the end's actually going up rather than going down, which and under this system would give them extra intensification allowance. This could have been natural capital. In fact, we did do the natural capital as well, and just try out all the different allocation systems just to see what the effect would be. And you can get information on the number of farmers that would be affected by each of those different categories. The key thing about this, of course, is just nitrogen. If you were to do a map of phosphorus as well, it might look quite different. It might look the complete opposite. So finally, the conclusion is that we're not going to achieve our water quality objectives without really good soil and good land information. There's nothing new in that, but what I think is different is with the advances we're having in science is we're able to improve the accuracy of some of that information that we're using. There's only part of the story, of course. There's all the hydrological modelling that needs to be done, the ecological modelling, and you'll hear a bit more about that tomorrow. You'll also hear from Ken talking about how we've used this information, all of the other modelling, plus the socio-economic and cultural aspects, and used it to provide information to inform the collaborative limit setting process that is happening in Canterbury. That's it.